welcome to Writer, a program for and about writers. I'm Margo Martin, your host, and with me today is Kitty Oliver, memoirist and oral historian. Welcome, Kitty.
Thank you. Hi.
I am so excited to be here with you today, and one of the things I'd like for you to start out with, just to get our audience more familiar with you, is a little bit about your background.
Well, let's see. I've been a writer all my life, I like to say. From the time I was a little girl, I was writing poetry. I wrote the class song when I graduated, writing bad poetry, I'd say. But the writing interest really flowered once I went to college at the University of Florida, and I took some creative writing classes and wrote a short story that was published in a literary journal, so I really took off with that. But interestingly, as often can happen with us writers, you never quite know where that ability and that interest is going to lead you. I got into journalism because I had an English literature degree and had those creative writing classes under my belt, and gravitated into journalism, and for 20 years I had a career there writing feature stories, human interest pieces, and a column for the last 6 years. And after that, went back to school and got a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing, and began teaching that at the university level, teaching especially nonfiction and memoir writing, and then got into oral histories as a result of that interviewing background and collecting other people's stories. So it's been a varied career, I'd say, as a writer.
I would imagine so. You know, in your book, Multicolored Memories of a Black Southern Girl, one of the people that you write about is your Auntie Mary, and you describe her as being the family historian. And I'd like for you to tell me a little bit about her and how that perhaps influenced the kind of writing that you do.
Well, Auntie Mary was a character, that's for sure. She and my mother, Auntie Mary was my grandaunt, but she had come to Jacksonville from South Carolina, where my grandfather also grew up. And she was the only one in the family who would talk once in a while about that South Carolina background and the patois, the Geechee or Gullah heritage. And that's what set me out on this journey of writing Multicolored Memories, because I was kind of intrigued and wanted to know a little bit about that heritage and background, and she could even speak it a little bit, and me one of them. And so she had that flavor in her voice whenever she'd talk about the roots and the culture there. I didn't spend a lot of time with her, but she always stuck in my memory because of that. My mother never wanted to talk about that background, never wanted to talk about the old culture, because she was born and raised in the city in Jacksonville, and so that to her was a country culture. And she grew up in a time, especially within the black community, where there were those differences and those strata between those who were aspiring to middle class, at least within even that segregated environment. And the way you distinguished yourself, obviously, was in not having the country roots, or not practicing some of the behaviors of those country roots, but we definitely were country.
Well, in your mother's desire to perhaps avoid those kinds of qualities or characteristics, you have really delved into them in your book. And perhaps even in perhaps a celebratory way. Mm-hmm. And could you maybe talk about that and perhaps the motivation for going to that depth?
Well, I think by acknowledging, and when I say we are a country, it was just to acknowledge that those roots were there and they were a part of our upbringing, and part of my mother's, and therefore a part of mine, and a lot of the language that we use, the kind of storytelling that I grew up around, hearing my mother and her friends, and my grand-auntie Mary, obviously, that came from the roots of that South Carolina background and that South Carolina culture. So I think being a writer by nature and a listener and an observer, which is what a writer is to begin with, I was always attuned to those little idioms and the superstitions and the strange little contrasts between the way we were supposed to live and supposed to talk and things we were supposed to do versus some of the observances we would have at home that I wasn't supposed to talk about. And that kind of fed into this culture that I was interested in writing about.
How do you go about getting started with writing? What kind of process does Kitty take part in putting words on the page?
A lot of stalling. And writers don't like to talk about that, but I'll tell you, I can clean the house, I can cook. I'm not even big on cooking anymore, but I'll come up with meals, I'll drive, I'll go to the store, run errands. But it's a realization for me, though, that writing is a process that begins and continues beyond sitting at the computer. That it's getting into a frame of mind to be ready to almost have a visit from the muse, but to be ready to create. So I start with just phrases. And if I'm lucky, maybe a few paragraphs here and there. And it's like it's laying a foundation and it's building. And when I talk to other writers and when I talk to my students, I think some of them connect with that, where just putting it into the computer, whatever ideas are coming out in snatches and words, images, whatever, and just throwing it all in and then leaving for a while and then coming back and begin to work with each of the lines and shape them. Sometimes when I'm really lucky, I'll have a start of a story. Sometimes the beginning will come to me. Most times it's pieces within the middle, and then stepping away from it and then coming back and working on those pieces and building into a story and linking them.
You mentioned a moment ago your students, and I know that you teach writing and you teach literature. Could you tell a little bit about the motivation for doing that?
Well, it's funny, when I graduated college, I thought for sure I'd stay and get my master's and teach at the university and always live in that academic environment. And it took me 20-some years to end up living out that dream, as it turned out. But teaching to me is giving back. There's no question about it. I think there's a mission to it. And once you've been writing as long as I had been, and writing so many different kinds of things, because I moved into television production, writing scripts, developing programs as well on ethnic diversity, documentaries for PBS, I wanted to go back and talk to students about the variety of experiences that could be open to them just by raising your hand. That's what I call us writers, Are you a writer? You raise your hand in the culture and volunteer to be the tribal storyteller. And that it doesn't mean that just because you are interested in writing fiction now, or you say you're a poet and you're writing poetry, that that's all you'll end up doing. Because I've written them all, that the work, the subject determines the genre, but that you can cross over and write in many different genres. So I started out teaching composition. I've taught composition. I continue to teach literature because I like to maintain that academic writing background to reinforce that for myself and therefore for the students. And then teaching autobiographical writing, creative nonfiction, more biographical writing, using the creative writing techniques. I've written poetry, and I probably will go back to fiction, to short story writing again. But so when I bring that to the students, that's why I enjoy teaching at the university level. I can say I've done just about all of these, and I see how they interrelate. And that is really something that writers, I think, need to know, that regardless of the genre, there is a relationship. And it's all about writing and about technique and about skill and about discipline.
Something else that you do, Kitty, that is in itself a form of storytelling is that you're a jazz singer. And I just am enamored by that whole concept. And could you relate for us how jazz perhaps is a connection also with storytelling and writing, perhaps.
Well, I've always been involved in music at the same time as writing, from singing in church to the chorus in high school, and when I went to college, to the university. That was one of the few areas that was open as one of the first black students at the University of Florida. So I got involved in the musical groups there and singing. So I've done a wide range, from classical to spiritual to pop music, but I found my niche in college as a performer and began singing first folk rock music and then jazz. And it's a way of connecting with an audience in the same way that writing is. There's a freedom, especially in jazz singing, and I don't consider myself a classic jazz singer, but I certainly am a jazzy singer, because you get to improvise a bit. You get to work with feeling, with emotion to the song, as opposed to just the formalized style of singing. And I use music a lot. I use jazz singing with the readings that I do and presentations, because it disarms people in a lot of ways. It relaxes them. It surprises them. And certainly jazz music does all of that in and of itself.
You talk also about the connectivity and the connection that jazz and music has with bringing people together. Mm-hmm. You talk about the way that writing can do that. Also in your book, you talk about food. Mm-hmm. And I know that food is one way that people come together and they share and perhaps let down their guard. And I was wondering if you'd mind reading a passage from your book that talks about the celebration of food.
Okay. I'm very much interested in how people relate across races and across cultures, and hopefully opening up a dialogue where we can talk more about our experiences one-on-one with people who are different and how we've grown and changed. And in the South, we definitely have a lot of experiences in common that we can share. This is from an essay called Jambalaya. Sometimes nowadays I get so discouraged about the minefields of hatred in this country that continue to lie in wait for those who dare to cross racial and ethnic lines. My heart can ache over an incident, especially in the New South, where so much movement forward has been made from so far back. Then I meet some other weary Southern travelers, perhaps munching herring, meat patties, or frijoles, and we talk ourselves out of the misery and trouble by swapping tales about some of our more savory times when we were young. In the South, we loved to eat. We even loved to talk about eating. But food meant more than daily sustenance. A hearty appetite symbolized good manners. A full refrigerator meant prosperity. With a dish in your hand, you could pass through anyone's front door. Breakfast was grits, not hash browns, and biscuits instead of toast. We ate liver or pork chops smothered tender in gravy as often as we ate scrambled eggs. Between meals, kids shelled pecans and drank Coke with peanuts that made salty foam when you put your thumb in the hole and shook the bottle hard. We might end up stuffed and feeling sleepy-eyed, and the older folks might be feeling poorly. But let someone come knocking on the door, and everyone perked up like Lazarus from the dead, and the saliva flowed again. Something was always on the stove or in the icebox to put out for the welcome visitor, and of course, the guest couldn't eat alone. In my neighborhood, we ate fresh turnips with the plump white roots, sweet mustards, boiled collards, stringed snap beans, and shelled peas cooked with the fat knuckle or muscle of a pig. We took tough cuts of beef and made them stew down and simmer long. Dinner was at 1 o'clock, supper was at 6. We sipped pot liquor from the vegetables, sopped up with a few slices of light bread. Parties were crab boils with tables of old newspapers spread out as plates, and chicken and ribs grilled on a rack laid over a hole in the backyard. We Southern children knew that Mother's cooking was always supposed to be the best, but everybody else's deserved to at least be sampled. We were brought up to be good guests. We knew to smack our lips with appreciation, moan with delight after every other bite, and ask for 2 or 3 helpings of food. It was nothing to drop by a friendly home with just an appetite and expect to leave with a big bowl of leftovers. And I share this experience about my mother who made contact with an old cousin from our childhood who came from Washington, D.C. to Jacksonville for a weekend reunion. In fewer than 8 hours after the cousin's arrival, the women had gone grocery shopping, cooked, and eaten 3 times. Over dessert, they planned the menu for the next morning's breakfast. Even now, years later, they still reminisce in detail about the food they bought but did not eat. And of course, eating was very important, and my mother said to be thin in old age, it makes you look sickly and underfed. But in rebellion, I like to keep low-fat, low-calorie food around. But every so often, I feel in need of a respite, and I sneak in some food for the soul. And more than likely, what I have the taste for is something exotic, and that's jambalaya. And of course, that has become a metaphor for the integrated and multicultural life that I ended up leading from the experience of moving into a bigger and bigger world, from growing up in a very limited, segregated environment in Jacksonville to the white world at the University of Florida and the multicultural world that I'm a part of now in South Florida.
Oh, that's wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in your current writing life?
Well, I have 2 books out, Multicolored Memories, the memoir. I have a collection of oral histories on race relations where I interviewed 42 blacks, whites, and immigrants who came from various places. They were either native Southerners or from other parts of the country and other parts of the world, to get some of their personal stories of race relations experiences, of awareness of racial differences, encounters that they've had, and ways that they have changed. And that's just been a wonderful experience for opening up the dialogue wherever I go, of having people hear some of those stories and then share their own stories. As a result of that, I've gotten involved in a couple of other oral history projects, a very large one around Lake Okeechobee here in Florida, interviewing people living in some of those communities. And I'm sure I'll be writing about that as well. But this process of storytelling, whether it's my story or having other people tell their stories to me, is very powerful. And I teach a course in that with students at Florida Atlantic University, where we actually go out into a community. They learn how to do the collection, and then we go out and actually interview people and collect those stories and give them back to the community. And I call it's a sacred encounter in a lot of ways, because you are going in and asking people to search their memories and to share, with a stranger. You begin as a stranger, but you end up being friends because you leave with a part of their lives. And there's also always a lot of hugging and not wanting to let go at the end of the encounter. So storytelling is powerful.
You talk so much about the significance of cultural diversity. Mm-hmm. And what do you see coming out of the kind of writing that you do and the kind of writing that you're inspiring students to do and to pursue? And how does that perhaps relate to where we are in our world today?
Well, that power of storytelling, as I said, is that when you have people talk not from a standpoint of rhetoric and intellectualizing what's going on and talking about what they've heard and what they believe, to talking about what they have experienced. They talk from the heart and from the personal, which is difficult to refute. First of all, it's your own personal experience, but in the process of talking about what you've experienced, you can also talk about how you've grown and how you have changed. And I think that in our society, we need to begin to make room for that now, to have a safe place and safe space in which we can dialogue about our differences, not from the standpoint of how different we are, but just what we've experienced, because of course when we talk about experiences, we discover that we're just all human, and the human experiences run the gamut, but they run through all of us, regardless of our culture and regardless of our background. You know, stories of love and of fear and of hate and disappointment and success and failure, those are just human experiences. And working with students, you know, and telling them that first to tell their own stories. And especially as we have more and more diverse students coming into our colleges and universities, we've got a wonderful resource there. Your background, your culture, your community, your neighborhood that you came from has a way of talking. The people have a way of talking there. They have a way of believing. They have a way of behaving. And if we start to tell some of those stories about what life was like in those communities and those families, and then start sharing them, because you're writing for the stories to be read, then we begin to learn and grow. And I think that's how change happens, as we share our experiences.
You make that sound so easy. And what I would like to know is how do you get people to the point of feeling confident, feeling comfortable, to be able to delve into those kinds of experiences and to be willing to share those? How do you get those little nuggets?
But that's why it's so important. That's why writing is so wonderful, because all of my classes are designed, I believe in writing to be published. Even if you're not quite there, you're writing with the understanding that this is to be shared. This is to be published and disseminated as widely as possible. So you write with a sense of responsibility then, and then it's not like cutting open a vein and just bleeding all over. You're writing with a little creative distance to it, which helps. And you're writing in a reflective way, which also helps. And as I remind students, this is not your story. Once you begin writing like that, it's no longer your story. What you're writing is merely representative of someone who has had that particular experience, but you're writing because it is a universal story. And you'll be surprised as you remind people of that when they're writing, that responsibility takes hold, and then the creative impulses, you know, start to really flower, and they see, wow, I hadn't thought about that. What I'm writing about. You know, I hadn't thought about that experience in a long time. I hadn't thought about it that way. And then they want to continue working on the story even after the semester ends. So for anyone who is writing nonfiction, who wants to write memoir, if you remember, it usually begins, boy, do I have a story. Boy, you know, my life has really been something. But once you sit down and begin to shape your life into a narrative that other people are going to read, you have to start making choices of what's the most important thing here that other people are going to relate to. And I think that when you write autobiographically in that way, you end up writing something that's going to have lasting value, because it's not your story. You are merely using your experiences to make a larger point.
I can really relate to that. I think that's terrific. You mentioned the whole idea of that writing is to be shared, and that you should write with the intent that you will be published.
Yes.
Let's talk about that for a moment. When did your big break come, and how what would you say to writers that envision that, they see that in their future? What happens? How do you get there?
Oh my goodness, I think there are as many stories about how to get published as there are authors, it seems. For me, even though I had been writing, you know, in newspapers and had been published for a long time, when it came to writing books, the oral history had a certain market, because there were people who were interested in the material because it was locally based. This book, Multicolored Memories, took conversely about 6 years. And each time, almost every year, I was sure that it was ready. And now, of course, I look back on it, 6 years ago, that it wasn't. And it really, so it evolved. But I think to remind people that it takes patience. Publishing takes patience. in the sense that you've written a work, but in order for it to go out into the marketplace, you need to have the feedback. And I think often what happens with people is they're not willing to make the changes necessary if it doesn't fly the first time, and they get frustrated. It's a message, and that's what I take it as, a message. Okay, you're writing to communicate, you haven't quite done it yet. And that means take it back, put it away for a while if need be, go back to it, rework it, work on it again. And that's what I mean about the patience. Instead of thinking that, well, I've written it, so now it must go out, and if it doesn't go out now, then I've failed. You haven't failed at all. And the more writers I talk to, the more I realize that some of the greatest works have taken sometimes 10 years that people have been working on it. Doesn't mean it has to take 10 years, or that it takes 10 years for everybody. But in that time, you're continuing to work on it, and it can only get better. It can only get better with time.
Kitty, I can't believe that we have run out of time, but this has been such a treat to get to talk with you. And I would like to thank all of you for joining us on Writer to Writer. We've been here with Kitty Oliver today, and I'm Margo Martin, your host. Thanks again.